agency meeting, so welcome. This is kind of just an extra meeting, but we certainly are open to general comments if anybody wants to comment, which I don't have any comment cards, so we'll move on. We have no public hearing items today, so now we're on to our favorite part of any discussion, which is budget. Mr. Danny Walls, will you join us? First, I need approval of the minutes from our last meeting.
I'll move approval of the meeting minutes from Tuesday, May 15th, 2018.
I have a motion from Board Member Mendenhall, a second from Board Member Wharton. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes pass. Okay, so we're just here sort of discussing, we did have a budget briefing a few weeks ago. I don't know any days anymore. They all run into the same. So, but there were some follow-up items, which is why, Mr. Walls, you are at the table. So I will open up the discussion for any follow-up. I don't know if, Danny, you want to start, or if any of the council members kind of want to jump right in. I think we're probably open to either.
I do not have anything prepared. I am flanked on both sides by council staff, which I hope is a good
It's
thing.
fine,
But, so
You're fine.
I kind of feel like I'm being, protected or something. No, I do not have anything prepared per se. We have had follow-up conversations. We've had some questions come up as part of that. I'm happy to try to address those in whatever detail the board desires.
And staff, if I could just, Madam Chair, just the staff has listed out some of the questions that we know the board members have brought up in recent weeks. We don't have to go through those, but if the board wants to, they're listed in the blue for reference. And then we've also included the overview staff report that was briefed on that first Tuesday, that date I can't remember either. And so if you want to go through any of the specifics on that, we can go there too. So.
Okay, Board Member Mendenhall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to ask about some of those general long-term policy questions, and just to make sure that if we aren't going to address those in this meeting today, that they are something that's on our short-term agenda. And one of those is around the use of PIF and whether it should be spent proportional to the areas that are contributing to it. And also that great flexibility of the PIF dollars for other uses. And then about the housing money, I had some question about, and I guess I wonder if you guys want to talk to us about the page 2 chart with the Salt Lake City Housing Program Fund Inventory. Ben, I'm assuming this was the work of you.
What gave it away?
The awesomeness of it. And I'll just set it up with the question that in my small group meeting, thank you for doing that to follow up on my questions from last time. I wondered if we are creating too much funding opportunity in the 60 to 80% AMI range, and whether we want to abut our funding instead of create overlap there, which would mean a reduction of the maximum AMI availability for the citywide housing fund contribution. I think I'm right on. I don't have my notes from that last meeting, but so basically, friends, right now, if you think about it, we've got some funding that goes down to 60% and funding that goes up to 80%. And so we may have a concentration of funding availability at our easier end of the housing spectrum to have built, which is that higher AMI range. And we may want to divide it out so the funding lines up and everything's covered, but we don't have a great deal of over opportunity in one particular area that isn't the hardest need area. We know that under 40% is our hardest to build portion. So correct me if I'm seeing this wrong, but I see that we have a concentration of funding in an AMI area that we don't need a concentration of funding at.
So there's a little more nuance that doesn't clearly come across in the table. These are the maximums and the minimums. And so when you see, for example, an 80% max, it's possible that a project that serves those lower AMI or a permanent supportive housing development would receive funding, but we didn't go into the funding history to show that level of detail. But it is a little more nuanced than first appearance on the table.
That, I guess I can, because I'm running the meeting. So, yes. For example, I think to what you're getting at is if we look at hand under the Housing Trust Fund, it's 60% max for rental, meaning you could be renting at a 40%, at a whatever percent, only getting up to that 60%, correct?
Correct.
But it does, however, seem that there is, I mean, I guess to Board Member Mendenhall's point, I guess it would be interesting to know the projects that are actually serving then the 40% or that area, even though, because then it, right now it does sort of look like it's concentrated in the 60%, but, and obviously not for any time soon, but I think it would be interesting to see how many of these different projects from RDA and from hand where they're actually serving. Right, like
Which
the
AMI?
reality of it. Because then I think that also helps to define some of these policy questions that I've been bringing up of what are the goals of hand and what are the goals of RDA and how do they move forward? If we're seeing that hand is, their projects are mostly in that lower 40, 50%, 60%, then maybe we just make sure we're creating policies that support that. And if it's the 60 to 80% that RDA we see more of, then we're creating policies that support that and kind of supporting each other in that way. But I think we would need to see where the projects are actually serving before we could come to any sort of policy. Does that make sense?
May I? Just to add to that, the council policy about mixed income, including mix in all of the developments doesn't lend itself to the chart very well. So the couple of the housing authority projects and others have a mix that includes the 40%. And maybe we can think of a way to refine that so that if you want to have that conversation, you can hone in on it some more.
And to add to that, I think sometimes projects apply for funding based on these cap levels for that particular part of the project. So it might be a mixed income project and the part they're applying for from the Housing Trust Fund is just to address their affordable units and not their market rate units. And so I think the chart is helpful just to lay out all the housing, this was the first time we've seen all the housing programs laid side by side. So I think now that we see them all laid side by side, we can figure out where more to appropriately draw those kind of role clarity boundaries, making sure that the money is going where you kind of intend it to.
The only other thing I would add is I agree with Jen and Ben in terms of this is great to see where these are and what those levels are and help look at how that should define both the RDA's role and hand's role moving forward. I would also add that you can do that on a policy level, you can do that on a department level, but I would also like to mention that you can also do that on an annual basis as part of your funding. And so when you allocate funds, whether it's annually or every 2 years, you can, as part of that funding, also specify what potentially your target or priority is at that time. So you may not necessarily want to overly limit yourself on a policy basis as much as also have that flexibility to where this year we want to focus on 40% AMI, support service housing. Next year we want to focus on 50% housing, home ownership. And so you can also drive that policy and put those restrictions on the specific funding allocations as well. But I think the broader conversation of agency, hand, programs, roles, I think that can be something that we can have that conversation and really try to make sure that we're not setting up that overlap initially too much.
So is that something I need to ask our chair and vice chair to set on a future agenda for us? Okay.
Yeah, we've started that conversation with our last board meeting in terms of talking about the overall housing funding strategy, and I think that starts putting some of those conversations in motion. I think we, as part of the direction from the board that we've received, we will be working with HAND and reaching out to have those conversations in terms of trying to identify where our roles can be. And then I think we do come back at some point either with a policy or discussion or some kind of work plan that we should have for probably both us and HAND in terms of how we want to move forward.
And I would like to see the actual usage
Okay.
rates. So not just who it's open to, but who's accessing it. Thank you.
We haven't, in the past, used the construct of an interim study item as it relates to the RDA, but in my mind, I think that this would be a really good candidate for that, and you could have a mirrored one that you adopt in conjunction with the general fund budget as well, just so that we formalize sort of what the intent is of the request. So we'll work on language and then get it out to you guys.
Sounds great. One thing I wanted to follow up with real quick is Board Member Mendenhall's question regarding the PIF and the proportional, spending it proportional to the areas. Can you give me pros and cons to that?
I can try. PIF historically has been the fund where we either collect income either from our parking structures and or receive income, proceeds either from land disposition. I think there are times that it's brought in funds also from loans, which now go to the revolving loan fund, as well as any other rental income that we receive that, for all intents and purposes, does not necessarily have the restrictions placed on it that it has to continue to be spent within a project area, but now is open to being spent across all project areas. I think there is a broad policy discussion that needs to happen for PIF that, for both us as staff as well as the board, looks at identifying how we would potentially like to prioritize use of those funds in the future. I think if we were to look at trying to reallocate those funds in proportion to how they come in, the pro and con of that is one, you're making sure that those funds are actively being reused within the project areas by which they were historically or at one time generated, and so you're leveraging those funds on an ongoing basis, which I think is obviously the intent of getting a return on your investment and reinvesting that back in the project area to continue to grow tax increment. The con, which I don't know if I would necessarily call it a con, but the advantage of having the flexibility of not necessarily spending those funds within that project area is those are the funds that you can then either start using as seed money for new project areas and or setting aside funds that at a quicker pace than which you could maybe normally do within a project area that is a little bit younger and is not throwing off as much TIF. Something that you could use those funds as a catalytic project, either within another project area or even outside of a project area that supports it. And so you would have that flexibility, but I think overall with PIF, what we'd probably want to do is set up some policy that's similar to what we did with the land disposition proceeds policy, where you have a ranking system of when you have PIF funds, here's potentially how you should look or set out your priority to how to spend those. Start with spending them within the project area and or look at spending them within another project area or identify other goals of what you'd like to accomplish with PIF. That's a conversation I don't think I've thought through and have all the answers to right now. I think we could look at that. I don't know if we've necessarily ever really kind of put that priority on PIF as much as we've just always used this as something that has a flexibility that we can use for revolving loan funds. And if we wanted to start targeting PIF and or the revolving loan funds to a priority that's based on project areas, I think we could look at that and dive more into those pros and cons. I feel that was a really long non-answer.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Board Member Mendenhall?
we ask Jennifer if she has any thoughts, because Dan, your list of cons was really a list of pros in a lot of ways.
To
Surprised
be
you
clear,
weren't
I
more-
did give that disclaimer when I listed them.
I think that in the past, the central business district has been so rich with tax increment that there hasn't really been the need, frankly, to keep that money in the central business district where most of it is generated. And the project areas that didn't generate TIF had a lot of needs, big sort of catalytic needs that needed to be filled, and PIF is a very convenient way to get a chunk of money towards a project that's not in a district that's throwing off a lot of increment. So I think the con is always that in years like this year, where the central business district is feeling a little bit of a pinch financially, not having that consistent central business district parking income makes it a challenge for central business district to meet the needs. So I think it is a policy call in terms of keeping the money in the districts where the money is generated, or using that advantage that came from the RDA investing in building parking garages to help some of those districts where they're not generating as much increment yet. So,
May I suggest that this seems to me that this could create that situation where we're in right now, where maybe a project area then becomes sort of subsidized or reliant on the income from somewhere else. And then if something happens where we're not seeing the same amount of TIF from the CBD, then what happens to those other projects that have now become reliant on that?
I think the way that you could address that is to have it just be a one-time investment, and that frankly is how the board has dealt with PIF over the years, is just sort of on a year-by-year, case-by-case, project-by-project, which is probably not what I would always advocate for in terms of, it's always good to have sort of long-term goals and strategies, but I think it makes it so that you're protected from that case where it's not that other project areas are guaranteed to get that PIF money. It's just if there happens to be a project. I keep thinking of the Central 9th streetscape project. A big portion of that project was funded with PIF dollars. And I think had it just relied on increment from that district, it might not have happened as quickly. And so it was sort of it can be a fortuitous funding source, I guess, in a one-off case.
Board Member Mendenhall?
Thank you. I think there's been this sort of evolutionary conversation with this board, and North Temple is one of those where we've specifically called out a catalytic project need, right? And this evolution of, do we invest upfront? Do we find other money to kick off a project area rather than waiting for a decade or two to finally have enough TIF to put into a catalytic project? And I'm really interested in this evolution on our policy side of the dialogue. And I think the PIF plays perfectly into that. So I look forward to us getting closer to a policy decision about, are we looking to shift the way the RDA functions to an extent by making it more possible for early catalytic projects to happen in an area? I hope the answer is yes.
That's certainly something we can talk about in the future that I expect from more conversations.
Madam Chair, I think to piggyback off of what Board Member Mendenhall was saying is that also, you look at catalytic projects that when you start out an RDA area like the Eccles Theater, look at what it's done and the type of revenue it creates. So it's a policy discussion, I think, when we even look at RDA areas to decide, is this an area that could use a catalytic project that could start off economic development in these areas? So I think that even if we're looking at an area, even beforehand we create it, we should be looking at catalytic projects in those areas to actually spur on development.
Anyone else on this right now? I do have one other question that pertains to what is number 1 in our staff report regarding, and this, I feel sometimes like I keep bringing things up, so sorry if I kick the dead horse, but homeless assistance funding. And first, I'd like to just say thanks for putting in the mission statement, because I think that helps this conversation that I've been trying to get my head around of these two different areas and what we're supposed to be doing and what the mission is of both HAND and RDA. And so, I think that this question is a really important question, is, are we going to continue funding out of the RDA homeless services? And if you look at the mission of RDA, it certainly talks about making sure that we are increasing economic development and creating spaces and capability for people to get for low and moderate income housing. And then we have this homeless assistance. And as it says in our staff report, you know, the state law does not define homeless assistance. So how is the city defining homeless assistance? What is that going for? And really, is this something that makes sense from a policy discussion for RDA to be doing? Or is there a way, again, for that money maybe to go to hand, once we kind of figure out how these are going to work together, where hand is the one kind of making sure that that money is going towards these homeless services in that like 40-50% AMI. I don't know, but this is a discussion that keeps seeming to come up, and I think that we need to really have a look at that and what that means policy-wise, and maybe it just needs to continue happening, but I kind of feel like I keep asking these questions and I'm getting like little bits of pieces of an answer every time, and I just want all of us to come together and figure out what's going on here.
So to answer part of the question of what is the money going for, I think there was a chart in the community and neighborhoods budget staff report from I think last week or the week before that showed the categories, but it was generally the sort of costs relating to Operation Rio Grande and some of the sort of specific funding sources there. So I think that would be the short answer. I can pull that up really quickly. In terms of what is the money going for this year. I think long-term, it's up to the board's discretion in terms of whether it's appropriate for RDA funds to go towards homeless assistance. So that's just a policy call for the board to make, I think, rather than having staff determine, because I think there's enough leeway for it to go either way.
Cindy and then Councilmember Luke.
I want to confess that at one time in our office budget work, we were looking at how can we use some RDA money to clean up an RDA area or to catalyze development by first getting the problems addressed. So I want to confess to that and just say that it is, as Jennifer was saying, not the question of is it appropriate, but is it preferred? And so this board could decide either way and be entirely on firm ground. So it's more of one of those, how do you want to prioritize and how do you want to fund your programs. Generating tax increment is important.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think this is, we've been struggling with this issue for quite a while. And when we look at many, not all, but many of our RDA areas, there is homeless issues that we do have to deal with in those areas. The benefit, I think, of us as a board also wearing dual hats as the city council, we have an opportunity to really look at both areas policy-wise, but also look at both as a revenue source. And how do we pay for many of these services? I think when we talk about catalytic projects, one of the things that I would like us to begin looking at as a way to deal with many of these redevelopment agency areas is that these are also really good areas to develop better housing opportunities in. Not saying that we're going to put all of our resources or all of our affordable housing in RDA areas, but one of the struggles that we've had, especially with our downtown area, is how do we have do we have the population base that is going to be living downtown to warrant having grocery stores, to warrant dealing with some of the more difficult areas, and with population, then you're able to start bringing some of these other amenities to areas. So what I would like us to do is, keep our dual hats, and instead of saying, well, do you know what, this may be more, more of a benefit for the general fund to do, and we don't really see it as an RDA. The reality is, a lot of what we're going to be talking about, and when we improve homeless services in these RDA areas, it is going to benefit that RDA area, which will in turn help generate more tax increments. So I do think that the RDA does have a role. How it's managed and how we utilize that, I don't necessarily think that the RDA needs to, have, homeless coordinators or things like that. I think, contracting with hand or, another city agency makes sense in that capacity. But I do think that it definitely is of benefit to look at the RDA as a funding tool for some of these issues, and especially if we start looking at housing as a piece not only for our redevelopment agency areas, but anytime we're talking about redevelopment across the city, that we're looking at and encouraging more dense housing in some of these redevelopment areas, even if they're not necessarily RDAs.
And to that point, I don't disagree with you at all, Councilmember Luke. I think that RDA has a very important part in making sure that the areas that we create are uplifting the entire community in from everybody that is there. The concern I have is that this $1.2 million went straight to Operation Rio Grande, and that is the broader question in my mind. Because I 100% agree, and I think that is very well stated within the mission of making sure that there is access to affordable housing, and it says low and moderate housing, and because without access to that housing and without all of that mixed income, you're absolutely right. We're not actually lifting the entire community up, which I think is hopefully the goal of the RDA, right? To not have this gentrification where we're pushing people out, but rather making sure that everybody is lifted up. Problem is that there was $1.2 million taken from that budget for what we've heard is a one-time ask, hopefully,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so that is, I think, where part of my concern comes from. And if that 1.2 is in a project area, I think it's just sort of bringing that to light and to the attention is that are we going to get a similar request next year where it's not, I don't know. I don't know the answers to that. And then
yeah.
after you, we'll have Board Member Johnston.
So, yeah, I mean, and I do think that it's, Operation Rio Grande is it's a difficult one because, there were, yes, the city was involved. The city wasn't necessarily, driving a lot of this. We were involved in some of the decisions, but when it came down to funding, the city had, there was a certain amount that we had to fund. What I've told, community councils and other groups, while I don't necessarily agree with everything that Operation Rio Grande has done, I think that there are, definite benefits to doing it. And the biggest benefit is the fact that we have, the state and the county have partnered with us, I think, effectively, in this case. And there's no way that the city has the resources available to fund everything that was done in Operation Rio Grande. We just don't. And I think to that point, not only did we not have the funds in the city to fund everything, we didn't have necessarily the funds in the city to deal with all of the requirements and responsibilities that we had, which is why I think we ended up looking to the RDA, because there is a definite connection, and I think a definite role. And so, will we see another $1.2 million request in the future? I don't know. I think as Operation Rio Grande evolves, and we see the state kind of pull out from their police role and the county pull out from the police role, and more of that, shifts to the city. I think our costs are going to continue to increase on providing some of these services. The $1.2 million that we're talking about here, that is leveraged with state money and county money. Is it the best use of that? I think it actually is. I mean, I think, when it comes down to, whether we, share the responsibilities of funding some of these issues. Homeless services is not something that is, a fun thing to fund, but where there are shared responsibilities, I think with the RDA, I think it does make sense to have that 1.2 million coming from the RDA in this case, and we'll see what happens in the future. And if I think especially with the responsibilities falling more on the general fund, we're going to see a continuation of that. And so I don't see that this discussion is going to end, unfortunately. I think we will continue to have this discussion and figure out how to deal with it the best we can.
I agree and disagree. I disagree because I think homeless services are fun to fund. I'm a big fun guy about that. The rest of it's pretty close, Charlie. I agree. I think, number one, the policy, in my view, should be that the RDA should fund housing. I think if we're going to address homelessness with the RDA money, it should be in housing as written in the bylaw. Now, that being said, as a policy should apply 80 to 90% of the time. And then in the 10 to 15 to 20% of the time it doesn't apply, we should have a robust discussion about why it applies in here and take this as the lens. What he basically just said, that we need to weigh why we make an exception to our policy based on the returns on that money for economic development or other needs in an RDA area. Operation Rio Grande is one of those 10% times. We, for the sake of getting it done, we had to agree to some financial terms, and we did, and there's a way to do this year. I would like to see you hold that policy, though, and so that we are accountable to the policy ourselves, and if we are going to violate that policy or use an exception to that policy, we have to have a discussion, and we have to give rationales why it fits this. I think that'll help us going forward because I like the flexibility of it. I think there are times when we do need to use some of those funds for these kind of events. I don't want to throw the whole thing out.
Madam Chair, just to throw out an idea, maybe that is a little bit of what I've heard is maybe staff could draft a legislative intent to clarify why in this particular year for this one time the board was willing to consider spending RDA dollars this way, just so that, sort of for the record, for posterity, people understand why this is a 10% case, and that in the future the RDA money should be focused on providing housing, which also helps the homelessness situation, but also speaks more directly to the RDA's core mission. Is that, and obviously, we can wordsmith it maybe at the next RDA board meeting or send it to you guys, but just to kind of clarify for the record why it is you're considering. It sounds like there's not the interest necessarily to pull the money back. And so absent that, just having clarity for the record of why it is you guys approved that money so that, in future years we're clear.
Yeah, I agree. I think clarifying between services and infrastructure sometimes is helpful. I think we need to wear both hats, as Board Member Luke said, to make sure we're talking through, are we as a city and the council willing to fund services when the county traditionally is the funding mechanism for those behavioral health services? And we need to be clear about why we would do it as a city outside the RDA and how it fits with the overall objectives in that discussion. Therefore, if we do that there, I think as the RDA, we can say, well, let's use our funding for housing as our contribution to that and differentiate that from the services piece. Some of that's going to be tricky because when you pay for a Portland loo, are you paying for the actual toilet and or the services of monitoring it? And we have to get a little specific down there perhaps. But in general, I think services versus housing would be an interesting thing.
Board Member Mendenhall?
In drafting that, I might request that we not make it so clear that we are unwilling to continue that next year because of the unknown nature of multiple sites needing to come online and the timing. I think that if we have a state and a county continuing to come to the conversation, and there's an expectation of us to continue participating in that conversation, and I don't want this to be perceived as a hard stop for us.
Thank you. I think that's a good point because I don't, to Jen's statement, I don't think I certainly don't want to pull the money. It's more, and maybe the policy question is a tad bit premature based on the fact that we don't know how this is all going to come about. But it is something that I think we should look at. And I appreciate the housing versus services, because that is so vague and undefined. And I think, again, this is sort of my lawyer brain where we define the word "and," right? And so there's some of that I want, yet I agree that there should be some flexibility, and that 10 to 15% where you're saying we have these reasons why this fits that exception. So it's certainly not something that I agree we're going to solve today, but it's a conversation that I think we should be having so that we can really be effective with the money, right? And that's the goal. So that goes in the parking lots. Board Member Johnston, did you want to say something else? Okay. Anybody else on this budget stuff? In that case, there is, that I can think of. Do you have any announcements, Danny?
None at this time.
I don't think so either. I don't think we have anything. And so,
Madam Chair, sorry, before we move on from the unresolved issues item, we had a question come up in the council chair vice chair meeting of whether or not we need to schedule a follow-up briefing on June 5th, next Tuesday, for another RDA unresolved issues discussion. It doesn't seem like there are any additional unresolved issues unless board members feel differently. So we'll communicate a draft of what that legislative intent might look like and circulate that with the board members electronically, and then we get your feedback that way, and then that way next Tuesday we can just have council meeting. Does that make sense?
yep,
Okay,
that sounds great. You're off the hook, Danny.
I appreciate that.
All right, if there's nothing else, we have our consent agenda, so I'll look for a motion there. I feel like sorry. I have a motion by Councilmember Luke and a second by Board Member Mendenhall. Any discussions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That is it for us today.
Council members, do we need a break, or do you want to roll right into council meeting? Okay. Does that mean you're going to stay in the room?
That was the real question.
Yeah, exactly.
Without a formal meeting tonight, the sooner we get done, the sooner we go home.
No.
Just went down that way.
Kind of felt like, oh, crap.
We'll just take a moment to switch the cassette tapes or whatever it is. James Andrew will jump back in here in a second. And I have a cold, and in lieu of losing my voice, I'm going to hand the chairing over to Vice Chair Wharton for the day. I know.
How dare
Just
you.
become more and more. Do you mind?
Yeah, no.
Thank you.
Absolutely not. Right, as chair, first point is to sanction Charlie.